Welcome everybody to this webinar event with Professor Ella Diaz. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So today's webinar is being recorded and it will be archived on our Bakersfield College Social Justice Institute website after the fact if you ever want to refer to it again or encourage your friends, students, or colleagues to check it out in the future. And we have a great archive there of material that we're trying to build related to the Central Valley across many different disciplines, history, literature, and the arts. So we're happy to have Professor Diaz contribute to that effect today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my email so there's no annoying rings during the webinar. I'll also say, before I introduce the speaker, that I want to thank again all the folks in the events management office at Bakersfield College for helping with the logistics for not only this webinar, but all our webinars that we do and events on campus. Thanks, Kim, for being our captionist for today. And a big thank you to Digital Ethnic Futures and Rupika Rizm and the Mellon Foundation for funding, among other things, this particular webinar series that this is a part of. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker and go over again a couple of logistical points. So Ella Maria Diaz is professor and chair of the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies at San José State University and serves on the Editorial Board of Aztlán, a Journal of Chicano Studies. She specializes in Chicano and Chicana art, performance, and political activism during the US Civil Rights era, and in the visual and cultural analyses of testimonio as an art of the Americas. Her first book, Flying Under the Radar, with the Royal Chicano Air Force, mapping a Chicano and Chicana art history, won the 2019 National Association for Chicano and Chicano Studies Book Award. In 2021, her second book, José Montoya, received gold medal awards for Best Arts Book and Best Biography from the International Latino Book Awards. Among several chapters and journal articles, Diaz's 2017 essay in Aztlán, a Journal of Chicano Studies, was anthologized in the Chicano Studies Reader, an Anthology of Aztlán, 1970 to 2016. And I'll say just anecdotally, I had the pleasure of meeting Ella several years ago at the Sal Castro Memorial Conference at UC Santa Barbara, where she was presenting her brand new book. So I'm super excited to have her back talking today. And again, she's going to talk for maybe somewhere 30 to 40 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So you're encouraged and welcome to use the Q&A feature if you want to drop a question that we can take in the Q&A period, and you're welcome, of course, to use the chat feature. So again, thank you, and please join me in giving a nice virtual welcome to Professor Ella Diaz.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Right now, I'm trying to figure out how to appropriately share my screen. Let me make sure. So just give me a visual cue. Am I correctly sharing my screen?
Yeah, I can see it, Ella.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction as well. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciated the invitation to be a part of this series, an important series about California's Central Valley. So the title of my talk today, Central Valley, California's Chicano Art Corridor, is really an idea that I've been thinking about for some time. And it started thinking about it when I concluded my first book, which I'll discuss in a moment. But also the idea comes out of a talk that I gave in 2021 for Professor Octavio Barras at the College of the Sequoias in conjunction with an exhibit, a Chicano artist and Royal Chicano Air Force co-founder Ricardo Favela, Seen and Unseen. And because of the role of the Central Valley in California to the Chicano movement, as well as the vanguard generation of Chicano artists, I was reading the early Chicano art discourse that uses mapping frameworks to capture the history of Chicano art, locating its primary production in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and to a lesser extent, Sacramento as major places of its happening and evolutions. Sacramento, along with San Diego and San Jose, were considered secondary, and the Central Valley cities and towns like Fresno, Tulare, Bakersfield, Dinuba are not really mentioned or mapped at all. Again, I will elaborate on this point, but before I do, we're looking at in this slide the exhibition announcement of José Montoya's Resonant Valley at Fresno's Arte Americas that ran from May to November 2023. And to its right is one of the installation choices in which the curators and other contributors matched Montoya's 1972 poem, Gabby Took the 99, on one of the exhibition walls. In 2017, I published my first book, which is also the first book-length analysis of the Royal Chicano Air Force, that vanguard Chicano art collective in Sacramento, and of which Ricardo Favela and José Montoya were two of several founders. This particular Chicano arts collective is connected to several historical events or broader contexts, including the Chicano movement and the rise of the UFW, the free speech movement, the student movement against the Vietnam War, and the US civil rights movement. But it's also tied to the Third World Liberation Front strikes amid the decolonial turn in former colonized countries. And of course, I didn't know all of this when I started. The stakes of my research came with time and exposure to Chicana and Chicano art history, literature, art, and culture. I entered graduate school around the time of the 2001 exhibition, Just Another Poster, Chicano Graphic Arts in California, and the digitization of RCF's collections at California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives, or CEMA, alongside individual members' collections like José Montoya and Ricardo Favela, as well as historical Chicano arts organizations like Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco. But I had no idea who or what the RCF was. In the foreword to my book, I addressed the regional hegemony under which I was educated while growing up in Northern California. I write, high above the ground, flying towards someplace else. I recalled a moment in José Saldivar's Border Matters when he reflects on his education in South Texas. While very much the center of the universe, his hometown was also a place where history began and ended with the master periodizing narratives of the Alamo. Saldivar writes, I learned all the facts about regional hegemony and global colonial cultures. For culture, my teachers believed always lived somewhere else, never in our own backyard. And in my case, or rather on my plane, I realized I too believed American culture lived somewhere else. Much like Saldivar, who left South Texas to study American literature at Yale in 1973, I headed to Virginia in 2000 to learn about American culture because I thought I knew hardly anything about America. So I'd grown up in Northern California in proximity to RCF Public Art. I even attended high school with the members' children, but I had never heard of them nor individual members like José Montoya. So the 20-year resonance between my meditation on Chicano intellectual erasures and creative ones is not unique to me or Professor Saldivar. But this is art history, you may be thinking. This is humanities and not social science and the Western institutions tradition of partitioning intellectual work into academic silos called disciplines. Well, this is where it gets really Chicana and Chicano studies. So in my view, Chicana studies is an interdiscipline more so than an interdisciplinary field. It's an interstice between the domains of disciplinary knowledge production made and reinforced in Western institutions or systems of thought to be Foucauldian and to acknowledge colonial power in our contemporary lives. Chicana studies and ethnic studies more broadly exposes then intervenes on the colonial, now neoliberal forces of racism and sexism implicit to academic disciplines, both of which produce and order knowledge or where it's located. And so, for example, here we're looking at a graph produced in 2015 by Dr. Adriana Zavala, an actual art historian who tracked the production of dissertations on US Latinx art. And where that pink arrow is, well, that's where mine is. And in fact, that entire row has the majority of dissertations completed. And note that it's dissertations completed in other disciplines, so outside the discipline of art history. So where, what, and unfortunately, who determines knowledge production continues to depend on individual actors, and this matters for BIPOC communities and scholars. We're now in a moment of a critical mass, if you will, of research and book publication, article publication on US Latinx art history. But at this time, we really can see why there was sort of this erasure or a lack of it. It's because art history as a discipline was policing its own borders of what was or what is American art or art in general. So people always all over the history of knowledge, and thus knowledge is never neutral. There was no Chicano art history in the early to mid 20th century because it was not allowed into the field of art history. So we see how borders are ideological as much as they are geopolitical. My second book is also part of that critical intervention that ushered in the now recognized field of US Latinx art history. But my book in particular is attached to the special collections of the RCF at CEMA that were digitized. CIMA, as many know, is located at UC Santa Barbara, which held the first collection of Chicana Studies materials called the Colección Loque Nahuaque, established in 1969 in tandem with the publication of El Plan de Santa Barbara. This is the educational plan upon which Chicana and Chicano Studies formed and disseminated at the institutional level, and where I currently work as the professor and chair of the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, what has the oldest MA program in Chicana and Chicano Studies in the nation. This department operates under the social justice principles of El Plan. So like the RCF CIMA 8 collection, José Montoya has his own collection there that's available somewhat online, and it drives the primary source analysis of my second book, which is the 12th volume in the AVER series with the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA. And as many know, AVER means let's see in Spanish, so we're seeing the materials. The scholarly foundation for the series was based on a study commissioned by the CSRC to address the absence at that time of U.S. Latinx artists from American art history. Scholar and curator Rita Gonzalez completed a 2003 survey of index citations for U.S. Latinx artists, and she revealed what the absence of 93 artists in American art history looks like over time, or what the resultant damage of the absence of scholarship on such artists does to a shared cultural consciousness. And she found that few artists on her list had more than one article published about their work. Often the few articles published consisted of brief exhibit reviews. In comparison, searching for 100 of the most exhibited non-Hispanic artists would yield thousands of entries. So the point again I want to underscore is that knowledge production is not neutral. It's ideological, and it has people all over it. Further, all bodies of knowledge from art history to science and technology have histories, both their events and happening, and their recording and telling. The historiography for the historians, or what I tell the students, the history of the history. And with the sweeping rise of artificial intelligence and research and online access, it will be interesting at best and scary, probably more likely, to see how AI impacts knowledge production in the social sciences and how memory and places are recast or reconfigured in the history of Chicano art. And the reason I say this is because in the 1980s and early 1990s, this question about the origin of Chicano art and how it would be told was a critical question for scholars as they tried to capture the art of the Chicano movement, particularly the grassroots muralism that emerged as a critical tool of consciousness raising for its major demands, which included labor rights, enfranchisement in the nation, and access to higher education for Chicana and Chicano people. Along with serigraphy, called silkscreen posters, muralism is the major visual art of the Chicano movement and the Third World Liberation Front strikes in the San Francisco Bay Area that led to the establishment of ethnic studies programs, departments, and the Vanguard College at San Francisco State. This recent political past that catalyzed an art movement urged Chicana art scholars to map as a method of preservation, which is now, I would say, a dominant method. Schiffer Goldman's 1993 essay, How, Why, Where, and When It All Happened, Chicano Murals of California, used frank language to lay bare the diverse elements that had influenced Chicano art in California. And she draws on the basic questions of journalism, which are formulaic, but intended to gather and disseminate the facts of a news story. The immediacy of the information she makes available actually replicates the philosophy of the RCAF, whose members wanted to communicate information to viewers who were disenfranchised and excluded from US society, and secondarily to express a Chicana positionality to non-Chicana audiences with power and privilege. An unassimilable element of Chicano art, whose practitioners in the RCF were institutionally trained, but used their training to cultivate a specifically Chicana worldview. Goldman's impulse to map rather than chronologically or thematically order Chicano art history resounds in my mapping of the RCF's name in the introduction to my first book, because I too approached the history of the name change from Rebel Chicano Art Front to Royal Chicano Air Force through a set of people and places, pushing back on the Western impulse and colonial logic to chronologically date things. And what I mean is that overarching sense of time from BC and AD, as well as the economic structure of time as a capital accumulation that is then idealized in the cultural nationalism of the United States as the value of progress. And I find the story of the members' attachment to dating their collective start date as 1969 to be more interesting than upending that myth. Further, as I visually analyze in the book's introduction, the RCS body of work exemplifies a theoretical tradition in Chicana art of reconfiguring symbols and images of land from colonial epochs to rethink the geopolitical borders that had bifurcated Mexican Americans' historical consciousness and social realities. Aerial and terrestrial views of land are important metaphors in RCF art, articulating a call for the decolonization of the Chicano mind by reimagining colonial history implicit in geopolitical borders. So one of the connections I made with contemporary Chicana art that centers the decolonial are the art historical antecedents in RCF posters like Rudy Cuellar's. And I write that the aesthetics of Cuellar's decolonial message continues in the 21st century in both artistic intervention and scholarship. One need only glimpse Jesus Barraza's poster Indian Land, which he designed with Nancy Hernandez, to see a connection with Cuellar's artwork. Barraza presents a map of the Western Hemisphere in red block color with the poster's title following the contours of the landmass. The simple image and bold title interrupt the geopolitical borders that guide our understanding of that Western Hemisphere, more so than America's, continuing the decolonial message in a new century. And I make this point here because I believe that the 1960s and 70s Chicano artists did not begin nor intend the mapping framework as a solidified notion of place and its import based on a modern ideal of the city as cultural capital. They, like me, like all of us, had always felt culture lived someplace else, never in our own backyards. And so this is the power, the homogenizing force then of a dominant culture, the master narrative of a nation. Decolonizing consciousness by way of history, then, is a project of memory reintegration, of healing the compartmentalized mind. So decolonizing maps of Chicana and Chicano art history has deeply informed post-Chicano movement scholarship on figures of Chicana and Chicano history. So think about the Peresian decolonial imaginary, in which Emma Perez intervenes on the association of great figures, mostly men, and spatio-temporal mappings of great events in US history. And by spatio-temporal, I'm thinking about units of time and spaces of territory. So when we think of a figure like Abraham Lincoln, but probably just Lincoln, some of us think 1865 or just more broadly 1800s, but most of us do think US South. So how we can abbreviate or abridge a figure to think about a space and a time. This logic, I argue, was transposed onto early Chicano art scholarship and a lot of intervening scholarship because it was the dominant narrative. We begin to see recovery work and interventions in scholarship by Chicana art historian Charlene Villaseñor-Black and her recovery work on Antonio Bernal, known sort of positioned by vanguard Chicana art scholars like Schiffer Goldman and Tomás Ibarro Frasto as the first Chicano muralist. And Villaseñor-Black pushes back against this using Bernal and interviews with him. And he really sort of rejected that title, not because he was rejecting being a Chicano artist. He was rejecting sort of the parameters, the delimitations that put on him. After all, he had lived for a period of his childhood in Mexico City. He had artisan parents. He had lived in Santa Barbara. He attended junior college at the College of Sequoias in Visalia, and he had studied dance and ballet with the San Francisco Ballet. He also bore witness, as she covers more broadly in The Artist as Eyewitness, to that pivotal year of 1968, the DNC conventions in Chicago, the subsequent riots, the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. And then we begin to think differently about that diptych of murals and those processional lines that he creates as being more rich, transnational, third world in their turn. So decoloniality as a theoretical lens and historical trajectory is wide, long, disruptive, and complex. Subsequently, it doesn't move in a linear fashion or chronologically. Instead, it's episodic, or it can be a somatic map, sometimes interconnected, other times fragmented. Thusly, we can use several episodes of decolonial ideas, declarations, and tactics that are engaged in, that happen and or are defined by larger historical, economic, and socio-political contexts. In other words, on-the-ground examinations that are framed by aerial views. And it's imperative to step back occasionally from the art, the poetry, and prose to consider canonical formations and canon wars that are central to knowledge production in the Americas. Decolonial artists like Antonio Bernal move in and out of historical periods and geographies, tracking thematic resonances, visual repetitions, and acoustic echoes, questioning notions of the beginning and end of things in relation to these terms of colonial and post-colonial. Their work asks us if the decolonial is an active verb, thus decolonizing. Is it a noun, meaning a state of being? And in 2019, I saw a pretty solid representation of what I'm after in the 2019 anthology, Latinx Environmentalisms, in which Professor of Environmental Studies, Dr. Jennifer Garcia Peacock, addresses the erasure of the Central Valley and its cities and towns like Fresno and Dinuba and Bakersfield, with a close study of Esther Hernandez's biography and canonical poster Sun Mad. And she does so by taking us on a journey that starts in Oakland in the morning, and Hernandez's rousing of her young son so they can make a good time on their trip home to the San Joaquin Valley. Peacock is specific with the routes, I-80, then I-5, Highway 152, and finally the Highway 99. The primary route for local traffic, she writes, Highway 99 serves as one of the primary axes in this rural landscape. She then meticulously maps the San Joaquin Valley to Dinuba and Hernandez's family home. Her attention to roads parallels her focus on irrigation ditches, canals, and the agricultural fields designed by Rose in a way that undoes the pristine beauty pursued by naturalist John Muir. In 1869, for example, naturalist John Muir arrived in San Francisco and immediately set out on the first of the many walks he'd take from the San Francisco Bay and Sacramento San Joaquin Delta across the Central Valley and to the canyons and peaks of the Sierra Nevada near Mount Whitney. These journeys in the mountains, the most beautiful as I had ever beheld, would form a cornerstone in the aestheticized imaginary of the modern environmental movement. Peacock then reads and responds to Muir from her studies and now scholarly intervention. After all, she's using her training in environmental studies as well as her research in architectural design to reconsider the bioregion of a vanguard Chicana artist, Esther Hernandez, as central to the art object. Muir's line of vision then, standing at Pacheco Pass, moved east across the fertile Central Valley. His line is valuable to our understanding of this landscape because it thoroughly and thoughtfully covers several ecological zones and over 200 million years of geologic history. And at sunrise, it's truly a lovely garden framing a ground mountain range backlit along the eastern horizon. However, his naturalist aesthetic kept him from commenting on other aspects of the scene that are essential to the story: the then tiny village of Los Banos, the nascent raisin and citrus industry, and just to the south, to his right, the town of Dinuba. Peacock is quite polite and deferential to Muir as she critiques the lack of attention to agricultural industry or the built environment of the Central Valley's farm fields. In doing so, she intervenes on the concept of provenance in art history. She lays out this rich and deeply psychosomatic or emotional landscape of Hernandez's bioregion. She calls it a vernacular landscape, or the everyday mundane features of the built environment, such as roads, houses, irrigation canals, gardens, and bridges, as a tool to bring the homegrown messages found within Hernandez's print into clear view. Placemaking, she writes, at its root is about the materiality of belonging. Subjects form attachments to their material objects, produced in specific times and places, and these allow them to move through their past, their present, and future. Her exploration of Hernandez's biography recenters the subject, in this case, a brown Chicana artist, a mother and daughter, in the history of the art object. She does not mention any institutional collections or private ones or where the poster has traveled, only Hernandez's journey on her corridor of roads. And I recently learned from a colleague, Dr. Maria Luisa Alanis, that Hernandez's 1982 seriograph has been collected by the New York MoMA. It has been on permanent display at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art for some time, But also I was recently at Sacramento's Crocker Art Museum in mid-May for its annual art auction, an event where California artists provide their art for silent auction to support the museum. And a print of Sun Mad was made available, and I noted that no one had bid. So again, that idea that culture never lives in our own backyards. The cultural landscape, often not explored in our artwork's provenance, and that Peacock accounts for in her chapter on Sun Mad, made up of people, places, and things, is what Peacock describes as the family history, intimate landscapes, and aesthetic vocabularies, and what I playfully describe with the definition of nouns to capture the title of artist Stephanie Sauer's 2008 set of cards, The Noun Painter, with vanguard Chicano artist Esteban Villa, which maps his daily drive and stops in downtown Sacramento. His mapping of places is also present in Villa's later oil paintings of landscapes of the Sacramento region, aerial, but from the perspective of freeways. A child of farm workers, Villa was born and raised in Bakersfield and spent his adolescence working in the agricultural fields of California's San Joaquin Valley. After being honorably discharged from the military, Villa returned to the San Joaquin Valley in 1953, taking art classes at Bakersfield Junior College. He met visiting instructors from the California College of the Arts, formerly the California College of the Arts and Crafts, and they told him he was a good painter, a good artist. They said, why don't you apply over here? I was 23 when I finished the junior college and 25 when I started at CCA. I just went to school on the GI Bill full time with little jobs here and there. Villa experienced a deep sense of alienation at CCA in the late 1950s. He reflected to me that it felt eerily similar to what he experienced growing up in Bakersfield, where he recalls feeling hungry for art. Comparing his hometown to a desert, Villa elaborated that it's a metaphor for the lack of art, the lack of culture. I didn't have it inside my house. Again, recall that false dominant notion that culture always lives someplace else. He assumed CCA would provide the opportunity to grow as an artist in relation to the social context under which he enrolled in school, but he quickly discovered that the curriculum did not reflect any aspect of his experiences. So he left CCA after 1 year and returned in 1958. I went in there in 1955 as a freshman, he said, and then I dropped out for 1 year out of college. While Villa did not directly relate his departure to the school's lack of socially relevant curriculum, he alluded to it when he recalled meeting José Montoya once he returned to CCA. Montoya transferred to CCA from San Diego City College in 1958, and Villa mused to me that there was only 2 Mexicans on that whole campus, me and Jose, a gang. They said, oh my God, there's 2 of them now. And this is funny because there are actually more, not that much more, but there was a cohort of vanguard Chicano artists, including Sal Queso Torres. Aside from befriending Montoya, Villa found that not much else had changed. Again, there was no nada, no cultura that we could identify with, nothing to identify with, and no teachers and no interest by other professors. So it was kind of like being in the middle of the desert again. There was nothing there. Chicano art did not exist. Comparing the scarcity of educational opportunities for farm workers in Bakersfield to the Eurocentric focus of the academy, ironically the symbol of all such opportunities, Villa poignantly conveyed that his desire for education was infused with a budding labor and class consciousness alongside a growing interest in his cultural and racial ethnic identity. As co-founder of CSU and CSU Sacramento professor, Esteban Villa created these paintings that I've been moving through in the early 2000s. Villa worked in series or concepts in the latter stages of his life. He once called these his freeway paintings in a conversation with me. I believe the exhibition announced on the postcard that I shared was the major or only showing of them together. In this one titled El Dorado Hills, Villa told me the view is from Freeway 50 looking up and from downtown Sacramento. Complete with his hidden jalapeno, which you can see embedded in the fields right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Villa said he constructed the landscape and the buildings out of the fields, the farm fields. So those rows with their irrigation patterns and canals and the people in them planting and harvesting to provide the nation with our food is really what's captured in this aerial. So the aerial and the terrestrial. Like Esther Hernandez and Esteban Villa, Jose Montoya sketched landscapes of home places. And as I write in my Aver volume on Montoya, in the numerous landscape drawings that he created on napkins, paper towels, and scratch paper, he used line to explore different perspectives on the rural vistas that surrounded him as he came of age in New Mexico. Digital records of these sketches are archived in the José Montoya papers at SEMA. In addition, digital archives at UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center contain photographs and scans of Montoya's artwork. And here we're looking at one drawing from the collection in which he offers an aerial view of the farmland. And for a similar sketch, he writes that he was developing a series on New Mexican mountain remembrances. And such notations demonstrate his movement between text and image at every stage of his artistic production. This sketch is a detail used in the advertisements for Montoya's 2016 Abundant Harvest show at UCLA's Fowler Museum. It's an obvious play on the Central Valley's production of food that honors honors Jose's prolific work as well as his subject matter in a survey that included nearly 2,000 drawings, along with paintings, poems, sketchbooks, video footage, music, and other ephemera. The works on paper were displayed in boxes that evoke the flat containers and grape trays used to hold the Central Valley's harvested fruit. The boxes were installed in long rows, like the rows of the grapevines in a vineyard, allowing visitors to walk freely around them and look in their contents. So all roads lead Montoya back to the farm fields and the human lives of love, labor, and loss that sparked a social justice movement for human rights, which also used Highway 99 as one of the major routes of the 1966 Farm Workers' March. In 1972, Montoya publishes Gabby Took the 99, a poem I'm sure he recited for some time prior. Gabby took the 99 highway, el highway 99, el highway. The 99, donde se requio el troque con aquel gentío, the highway, down the 99, up the 99, ahí por todo el 99. El 99. As you leave the 99, who leaves? Whoever leaves the cold, ugly, dry, hot, slippery, bloody, dirty, foggy, sleek, powerful 99. Not Raza, Okies, Arkies, Chapos, Armenians, not even the Michigan Bothams, that impersonal 99, and not even crosses for the dead alongside this road of the timeless vanishing point. And in that infinity, you dare to dream, Gabi, the riches that passed as you turn tres loco. Y el 99 te iba a llevar allá, Gabi. El Gabi took the 99, la salvación, and he died in Vietnam of an overdose, pa cabala de chingar. And Visa laughs, and Dina laughs, and Goshen and Cutler, y el 99 laughs, and all do the Tecate tattoo taps. So Montoya's imagery is so visceral, it becomes familiar in the poem, as we see, hear, and smell 99. From brake lights of cars and odorous cattle farms to the billboards announcing routine stops, that constantly changing corridor with its dangerous passing lanes mark the distance and time remaining to all of our destinations. The poem has lingered in my mind for decades, but it would be only in 2021 that I really began to understand what and where Gabby was driving away from and toward, and how it intersected my father, David Diaz's journey during and after his military service in the Vietnam War. As his family moved from Southside Chicago to California's San Fernando Valley in the 70s, my dad headed up the 99 and in pursuit of a woman named Christine, who he had met in Los Angeles, but who was from Sacramento, and she later became my mother. My father's journey on Highway 99, as well as my mother's, are just ordinary stories, but they are extraordinary when lyricized, capturing the larger historical context that shape our lives, from war and conscription to unequal access to higher education, all of which opened a pathway for me to go to college. Montoya's poem takes us on an ordinary journey at an extraordinary time in Gabby's life, as he drives away from California's farm fields, leaving behind the campesino's lifestyle, only to die of an overdose in Vietnam. Through irregular but precise language, Montoya puts us on El Highway, all caps. But unlike Gabby, we know what's coming down the road as we are transported through space and time by the sound of those staccato tattoo taps made by another group of folks discussing Gabby and the irony of his death as they take their own trip down the 99. Staccato tattoo taps refers to heroin addiction and the tapping of veins during the injection of the drug. These taps do not signal military service, but through the word surface or its visual reference to taps, all caps, it may also suggest the bugle call at the end of the day on US military bases. Perhaps then Montoya makes a double entendre through the noise and the word, linking it both to the drug overdose and the larger context of systemic forces beyond one's control, like a lack of educational opportunities, a military draft that lead one down the road to nowhere. Recently, in my position at San Jose State and in researching my historical department, I discovered another point of connection pertaining to a decolonized provenance for a Chicano art object like Gabby took the 99. And yes, for all you art historians out there, I called a poem an art object. And learning about the department's creation in 1968 and 69, I came across an announcement of the first Chicano commencement at San Jose State, which was started as a walkout of students and community members. El Grito, a journal of contemporary Mexican-American thought, that vanguard scholarly journal established in 1967 at UC Berkeley by Quinta Sol Publications, reprinted a special issue of El Machete, a newspaper by the Mexican-American Student Confederation at San Jose State, and for which Mala Efe co-founder and vanguard Chicano artist Malaquias Montoya created the masthead of a Mexican revolutionary, complete with bandoliers and a big machete. And Mala Efe, for those that don't know, was an antecedent to the RCF and a good deal of the Chicana and Chicano arts collectives. And the acronym stands for the Mexican American Liberation Art Front. But the students' newspaper's name also paid homage to Luis Valdez, vanguard Chicano dramatist and co-founder of El Teatro Campesino, who wrote a column for El Excentrico magazine in 1964, a bilingual newspaper published in San Jose by Don Humberto Garcia. El Excentrico served Mexican-American, Mexican, and Latino communities across the entire Bay Area. Dubbed El Machete by Garcia, Valdez's pen name matches the force with which, quote, the young San Jose college student wrote about Mexican-American identity and the farm working experience with a deep contempt for American culture, for its systemic destruction of the Mexican-Americans' Mexican identity. So there are many through lines, corridors, and roads traveled between the ethnic studies requirement for all CSU students and students in the junior college system in California in the 21st century. The intellectual activism, public pedagogy, and critical thinking skills intrinsic to Chicana and Chicano studies are timeless in the Western universe because they undo the coloniality of power by offering other possibilities for world building based on consciousness raising, which is theory, and direct action, which is praxis. For me, one of the through lines is with Gabby Took the 99 and an El Machete column from March 1964. I discovered a literary antecedent to Montoya's poem. Valdez recalls a memory of his farm working father and a drive they took in their red 1938 Chevy with its rough splintered bed piled high with near dispossessions. He writes in all caps and repeats Highway 99 as he and his father drive along, approaching highway signs for farm working towns like Fresno, California, and exits to other roads. You are now entering Santa Clara County, Highway 99. El Excentrico made its way across the San Francisco Bay Area and to Oakland, where Montoya was a student at CCA. And I'm certain Valdez's ponderance of Highway 99 as a metaphor influenced Montoya, as well as the all caps and the other visualizations of language, like its final stanza of poetic lines that descend into rhetorical questions. Little tremendous string of cherry pickers come like ants through the Bering Strait. 20,000 years ago, little string of little people. Who are you? Who are you? Quien sabe? Quien sabe? Where are you headed? Where do you go? The concept of corridor is both historical and methodological then, producing a theoretical lens that revalues the Central Valley cities and towns on terms that are meaningful to the particularities of the Chicano movement, both literally and historically. It also intersects dominant cultural notions of the road trip in the American imagination. Chicano art historical discourse in the late 20th century established a spatio-temporal map through a framework and periodization that focused on specific locations for Chicano art making in the 1960s and 70s, specifically Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento. Regarded as centers of Chicano art, these cities are critical to the proliferation of artistic genres and mediums that coincided with the socio-political, land rights, and educational agendas of the broader Chicano movement. But the mapping concept, with its implicit notion of destinations and locations, eclipsed a critical thoroughfare along which Chicano artists and their ideas moved and continue to travel. So rethinking California's Central Valley, not as a location, but as a corridor, remediates its role as a channel or conduit of creative ideas and artistic exchange. And rethinking California's Central Valley as an art corridor, one wonders if all the comings and goings, the departures and returns of Chicano artists to their farm-working hometowns near military bases are the creative engine that drives the entire story of Chicana and Chicano art. And to conclude, for now, this is my reading rainbow moment because you don't have to take my word for it. To riff off another well-known Sacramento, LeVar Burton, you don't have to take my word for it because the idea of the Central Valley as a metaphysical corridor of movement of ideas was already known and discussed by vanguard Chicano artists, including Gilbert Lujan. Lujan, better known as Magoo, was born in French Camp and was a vanguard Chicano sculptor, muralist, and painter who co-founded Los Four in Los Angeles. Magoo is among countless Chicano artists born and raised in the Central Valley, including those that I just mentioned, but also Rupert Garcia, Ernesto Palomino, the members of El Teatro Campesino, or if we're just thinking of the birth of El Teatro Campesino. And what do we see here in his 1976 illustration for the magazine, the art magazine Chisme Arte, that came out of the founding of the Concilio de Arte Popular. So the year that it's founded, this image is printed in it. We see in the crease right here, I believe that's Sal Castro. To his right, the semiotics of the Sacred Heart in Aztlán, that tells me it's probably Rodolfo Anaya, a reference to the Heart of Aztlán, an earlier publication of his, I think before Bless Me Ultima. So that's pretty much all I can probably identify, but I will note that famous Magoo bug. I first encountered this drawing or spent time looking at Magoo's Volkswagen bugs with a former student, Kevin Cruz, now Dr. Kevin Wilfredo Cruz Amaya, who recently completed his PhD in Chicana and Chicano Studies and Central American Studies at UCLA, and will be joining Williams College in fall 2024 as an assistant professor in art and art history. Kevin's work on Magoo's paintings and drawings of people on the move was part of an undergraduate essay he titled Gilbert Magoo Lujan, A Whimsical World in Refined Rasquachismo, that he created for my decolonial poetics and aesthetics class in 2017. It's now part of his brilliant dissertation that is done outside the discipline of art history, but will certainly be one of the field-defining books in the next wave of scholarship that reintegrates our history, culture, and memories within our Chicana, Chicano, and Chicanx minds. Thank you for listening to my kind of long talk.
Thank you, Ella. We're all giving you a virtual round of applause. As you kind of take a collective breath and get a sip of water, I just want to say that I'm so glad you consented to recording this webinar, because the visuals, it was very much a crescendo, as you said, it would be. And, we'll be posting this after the fact, and we'll try maybe to link in as well to some of the readings and things that I didn't know about the Luis Valdez essay, for example. I really want to read that. And I knew about the Latinx environmentalism, but I didn't know about the chapter on Esther Hernandez. So I'm super excited to follow up on that. Just in terms of logistics, again, feel free, anybody in the audience, to drop a question in the Q&A. If you're feeling the desire to ask live, we can just raise your hand. We can queue in there as well if you like. I do have a lead-off question, though, and I'm really thinking of my students at Bakersfield College. And you mentioned the ethnic studies requirement at CSU, and we have a new requirement at community colleges. But for a lot of students, it's sort of just a generic question, like how do you get started in Chicano art? And what I mean by that is not so much as an artist or even a poet, but just as a patron. Like where can you access Chicano art? Like what kind of advice would you give to a young person, student, who wants to experience Chicano art? Like, how do you access it?
How do you access it? Well, okay, so are we talking specifically about Bakersfield College?
I think I'm thinking about what you talked a little bit about, how culture is always on the outside. I mean, you folks travel, as you say, whether it's up and down in 89. But I'm just thinking again, like I know that there's the Cheech Museum right in LA, and you have places like Chicano Park, but as an art historian and scholar, I'm just kind of curious, what advice do you give, young people who are coming into this, not even knowing what Chicano art is? Like, where can you go to see it? Where can you access it?
Well, the first thing I would tell if I were teaching an introduction to Chicano and Chicano Studies course is I would ask them about their abuelitos. I would ask them about their tias and tios. Who sews? Who remembers their first dress? Was it store-bought? And if so, what embellishments were created? Who is the tailor in the family? Did you have someone in your family that made you block toys? The reason I would start there is in thinking about Dr. Amalia Mesa Baines, as well as Tomás Ibarro Frausto, and then just my work on José Montoya and the Vanguard. I would exactly, as the art professor of Barrio Art just posted, in our homes, exclamation point. I would decolonize art using Chicano methodology by looking at the makers in our family. What about our food? One of the things that I loved pointing out in my chapter on gender and the RCF, and it's my webinar, and so I can say what I want, but it's another sort of dig at my colleagues in the discourse is, as many here know on the webinar and the audience, that one of the sort of implicit conversations about the Chicano movement was its sexism and was the invisibility of women, et cetera, et cetera. And what I was arguing in my gender chapter is, we've established that the movement was sexist. Now what? Like, we as scholars, what damage are we doing to the record by just ending the conversation there? And so what I did is, in looking at primary sources, I'm going to circle back to your question, but at looking at primary sources in the archive, I came across grant writing for the different public murals that are in downtown Sacramento, specifically Southside Park mural, probably the most well-known of the RCF's murals because it's so public facing. You can see it from the freeway. It's also been historically landmarked. It's a huge amphitheater stage. It's beautiful. But in the overhead for it, you saw that it was written by Ricardo Fabella and of course I would forget I want to say Rosemary Rasul, but I could be wrong on the name. That's ironic that I forget the name of the other person who's Chicana. But the point is that they counted the women's, the food as a part of the overhead. So it's an example of the labor of making food to help feed the mural teams as being part of the art making. Then if we look at the 90s and early 2000s and we look at relational aesthetics and this idea of conviviality and making food together in museum spaces, we see that our groups were already doing that. And yet that's not being captured as an antecedent. That's why we need to revalue the cooking taking place in the homes, the sewing being done. If you look at the scholarship on Yolanda Lopez, if you look at La Domesticana, which is the framework that Amalia brings us as a response to Rascoachismo being more androcentric, there's all of these methodologies that are within Chicano art scholarship that I could apply in concrete ways to students, because I would say one of the principles of Chicano studies from the plan was to empower students first and then teach them. And Montoya would say confidence before competence, which is something that I deeply love that he would say. Be confident in who you are and what you know, and then we can teach you the methodology. Then we can refine you, but the confidence has to be there first.
I love that, looking within the home, this notion that art doesn't exist right within certain communities. I love that framework. Savio Bautista asked a kind of forward-thinking question. Like, when you think about the Chicano arts landscape, what are your some of your thoughts on the future of it? Trends that are happening, things that maybe we should pay attention to.
Oh yeah, there's one of the points I wanted to make with my graph. I'm very interested. It seems like it's really complicated or deeply intellectual theoretical work, but it's just a first-gen Chicana going, wait, wasn't there more books on Chicano art? Why weren't there more scholars? And I really appreciate that article because it shows us why. We're often taught, as you know better than me as a disciplinary historian, that we're taught that history is objective, that it's neutral, that you're just reading, there's no people in it. Even though that is a positionality, it's typically male and it's typically Eurocentric, that invisibility of having an identity. And so the reason I say that is to say that the future, I would argue my work is recovery work. What I see happening right now in terms of Chicanx and US Latinx fragmentation, identity, mixed media. I also see that in the 60s and 70s. And that's not me sort of pushing the 21st century onto the 20th century. It's just the deep recovery work that we have to do. The complexity, the multidimensionality of the vanguard artists, I'm seeing that show up in really important ways in the 21st century artists. It's important that we not reduce our own vanguard to sort of these monolithic or these sort of one-dimensional artists. And I think that if we look at Karen Mary Davalos's Chicano art since the 60s, Art Narada, that's one of the major arguments that she makes, tracking the transnationalism, the world building of several of the vanguard, looking at their Asian influences from tours abroad, looking at their European Renaissance influences from tours abroad, and taking that word tour back and thinking about the way in which in the 19th century to tour Europe meant something different than to be drafted or conscripted into a war. So there's a lot of double play Chicanidad in there. The other thing that I'll say is I believe his name is Patrick Martinez. I see a head nod. I'm also, when I was writing this about the Rose, I'm a little embarrassed. Narciso Martinez, who is winning incredible awards. I was also able to see one of his shows at Arte Americas in Fresno. I believe that Clarissa Garcia was still the curator there. And this is a first-generation artist that grew up farm working, that makes these incredible paintings, as well as sculptural objects of, you know, his people, of the laboring people. And I keep thinking about that relationship with not just the installation choices that were made for Montoya's shows and Esteban's lines, but how that sort of is a through line from the vanguard to the 21st century, which is exciting from an art historical perspective, but it's also important that we don't exploit that and further exploit the people that it's meant to represent, because that's why I say that ethnic studies and Chicano studies in particular is timeless in the colonial or the Western world, because one argument is you know, same-o, like use Basquiat, I hate to say it, but it's my webinar, same old shit, you know, that famous tag everywhere, that what goes around comes around. That's that sort of defeating idea. But the other argument is that it's not that it's the same, it's just that it's the constant pushback against forces of power beyond our control.
No, thank you for that response. There's an interesting comment from Charlene, and I wanted to bring it up because I think, again, it's been a through line throughout the presentation. She says, the theoretical and research implications of your talk are profound. They challenge art historians' focus on cities and return us to our Chicano roots and history. And then she also mentions, I wondered about, you know, rural studies, but also kind of seemed very focused on rural white populations. So I don't know if you have a reaction to that comment.
Absolutely. I wasn't given the, I went considerably over the page requirements on the Aver series. It can only be a certain set of, it can only be as long as it can be, and mine even then pushed the limits. So I really wasn't able to explore in depth Montoya's local literary influences, everyone from Sarayan and, you know, to Steinbeck. I couldn't really get into the way in which he was responding to American regionalism in terms of his training, because you have to figure when he's going to school, he's probably learning a lot about like American Gothic, the 30s and 40s and whatnot, but also what he's reading at that time. Sarayan, you know, was a newspaper man. And I think that's an important part to bring up, that, you know, when we think about digital literacy and we think about close connections to the world, while it was a material culture, Montoya was a reader. And so what's the closest thing, or what's the most accessible thing? It would be the newspaper. And so folks like Twain and, well, Twain was long gone, but I'm sure they were publishing, but Sarayan was publishing. There's newspaper articles, etc. And so the way in which he was engaging, and then I cover in the book more broadly Walt Whitman, the different influences, like all of us going to school, from public school to the university, our main engagement is going to be with the canon. So it is going to be European. I think that's why Montoya calls out that list, Armenians, Okies, and then the Michigan-Bothams, which, you know, I've done a little bit of reading on. I think that that's a funny play on Grapes of Wrath, but I'll have to look into it in more detail. But he was definitely responding to sort of the fabric and the diaspora. I think this has been more accounted for in music studies and ethnomusicology, not as a cop-out, but it's all that I know. I would argue like all of the RCF members I'm mentioning were musical. Certainly we know that Jose had the Trio Casindio. Esteban Villa produced several albums of music, and very much you can hear the influence of Bakersfield sound. And so that speaks to that larger mixture of like the German polka and the conjunto music and, you know, Jimenez and everything. So you start to see that happening. If music is one of the ways in which cultures, especially working in rural cultures, are communicating with one another, that would be the way. I think that earlier religious studies, theological ones, I'm thinking of older books, Vicky Ruiz from Out of the Shadows, as well as F. Arturo Rosales, also cover the way in which religion, particularly the Catholic Church, was sort of, I don't want to say weaponized, what was sort of taken or reappropriated by Cesar and by the National Farm Workers as a way of certainly not protecting them, because we know what happened during the marches and in the protests, but as a way of sort of, well, I'm going to say it, shaming a lot of the growers and the local agri bosses that, you know, would worship in the same churches as their laborers, as their farm workers, and yet wouldn't meet them sort of on these human rights, these basic needs, you know, food, clothing, shelter. So the last thing I'll say about this is, yeah, I mean, this is why I think Chicana, Chicano, and Chicanx art scholars continue probably to pursue their advanced degrees outside the discipline of art history, because there seems to be, as opposed to nowhere to go, like when I was matriculating, and so I did this in American studies so that I could do it how I did it for you today, which is still not a complete story, but it's certainly more integrated. But I would argue that now by choice, we still see scholars like my now colleague, Kevin Cruz, that are choosing to do it in this way because they want to capture the broader tapestry of that. And what I've noticed, and I already mentioned Karen Davalos's book, but there seems to be, we're in a moment now with enthusiasm and an excitement that we can look at the broader, by which I mean Eurocentric, African or Black arts, African, diasporic, and Asian influences on the vanguard generation.
Wow, thank you for that response, Ella. And again, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'll try to get to maybe a couple more. I don't want to keep us too far beyond 1 p.m.
About a softball.
I know. Well, there's a great question coming in. So it says, you know, great talk. Can you talk a little bit more about how the Central Valley has served as a physical site for art production rather than a place that inspires and or produced Chicano artists? And supplemental, it says, what places, galleries, parks stand out as important for producing or displaying art in the Central Valley, like Artes Americas in Fresno?
Yeah,
to take that one.
Okay, I will, but I also will push back and say, why does it need to be a specific place? Why do, you know, those books will come, they already are, but I'm saying what's something very unique to the Central Valley is the power of the corridor and the comings and goings and the maps of the way home, and that being sort of the origin, the inspiration of all of Chicana and Chicano art. But to give you a sense, so, and I take for granted what everyone knows, but for example, Dr. Villaseñor Black's book, The Artist as I Witnessed, and then her briefer pieces about it in Aztlán, Antonio Bernal, you know, it's no small feat to be called the first the Chicano muralist. So the diptych, those wooden panels of the procession of 60s and 70s civil rights leaders, and on the other side, the replication, his own creation, but the replication of from the Casa Bonampak, I believe, or the Mayan indigenous priests and priestesses, and them sort of meeting. I think in 2013, sorry if I have the year wrong, but Holly Barnett Sanchez had 2014 had a great piece on those murals right outside the original Teatro Campesino headquarters. And her argument was that they were performing, that they were ushering, these processional murals were ushering people in. No scholar had ever written that yet, so I found it to be pretty brilliant that she was looking at the performativity of the murals. When I was coming up in graduate school, the only place that I could find a picture, often black and white, of Bernal's murals, this important murals, was in a Schifra Goldman essay, and it was in black and white. And it was usually just the Casa Banapac. It was very rare that I got to see the other side, which is the line, if you will, the La Adelita or Soldadera, and then Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, someone that looks like Malcolm X, and it's a really brilliant mirroring piece. So the headquarters of El Teatro Campesino, certainly today, Arte Americas. I think that your local art historians in the Central Valley certainly know the names of their historical places. I think you're going to be very surprised to find in the next 10 to 15 years the amount of publications, book, article, and otherwise that will be coming out because of the proliferation of specialists in Chicanx art history. I would be considered senior now, believe it or not, even though I'd like to think otherwise, but a new generation of scholars now are matriculating through and starting their first job. So it's going to be really exciting. The other thing that I'll say is your very own Carissa Garcia is off to the Cheech as a curator, and she was largely responsible for a lot of these Fresno-centric exhibitions at Arte Americas. And that's just another example, someone that is from the area, but did her PhD, her MA PhD work at UCLA. And then of course, Octavio Barajas is on this call as well. He was a part of the Seen and Unseen, the Ricardo Favela exhibition. Favela is known for depositing collections of RCF posters at the junior colleges that he was a part of, as well as at my institution, which is one of the reasons I wanted to go to San Jose State, because he also deposited a collection of RCF posters, 193, which I believe is the largest number outside of the massive collection at SEMA. And the reason he did that was because of the master's program in CCS. So you see, again, because I see some of the other questions, a deep marriage, if you will, between the public pedagogy and the art. So another thing is to tap the faculty on the call. You should be tapping your libraries. It's never surprising to find out what's in your libraries in terms of what students have deposited. Even sometimes if you find out that one of the Vanguard artists went to the junior college, hit up the art departments, see what they have in their files and folders. You'll be surprised the histories that you find there. So to answer all of that, you know, I would start with Bernal, but I'm trying not to reinforce this idea of X marks the spot.
No, thank you for that. I'm going to try to sneak in two questions, one academic, and then I think there's a good personal question to kind of end with. So Nora Cisneros, who's one of our new ethnic studies professors at Cal State Bakersfield, she writes, you know, I'm thinking about what you said about regarding art as a public pedagogy. I'm also thinking about the presence and experiences of Central Americans in the Central Valley and how that intersects with Chicanx art. And she's wondering if you can share any examples about those intersections with Central Americans and then, you know, Chicano, so to speak.
Absolutely. So who I just mentioned earlier, I'm sorry that I don't have it off the top of my head, and I always get a little insecure that I'm going to get names wrong. So, but I had just mentioned, let me just make sure I have the name right. Narciso Martinez. Let me see, are you coming up? Yes. Okay. So I have it correctly. It's Narciso Martinez. This is a good example of a scholar, or excuse me, of an artist that is working, I would say, in very much so the representation of the vanguard, truly documenting the people, using what we would call methods of rascuachismo, using the actual boxes, packing boxes to construct these, not just elaborate, almost Dutch-like, the realist paintings of these huge scenes that are just they're breathtaking to see take up a whole wall. So sort of incorporating a bit of that muralism, portraiture. but also the sculptural elements where he creates these sort of pyramid-like sculptures of people on break. Now, he comes from this community. The reason I'm mentioning them is this isn't necessarily a Chicano community anymore, is it? It's Zapotec, it's certainly Central American. So looking at sort of the laboring force, what I call the love, the labor, and the loss in the Central Valley. And certainly not just of the Central Valley. So I would find connections there. If you want historical ones, they're all throughout Chicanx and Chicana and Chicano art history, as well as Chicana and Chicano history. One of the interventions that we have to keep making on contemporary thought on Chicana art history is that it was very much so a part of the Third World liberation efforts. If you look at the vanguard, everyone from Malaquias Montoya, Juan Fuentes, Yolanda Lopez, Esther Hernandez, Dinuba's very own, Judith Hernandez, the list goes on of the vanguard generation from the 60s and 70s that were deeply connected, as particularly to the Central American wars in the 70s and the 80s, the mass genocides of indigenous people. And then, of course, the historical refugees and really the origins of the sanctuary city that that younger people may have experienced for the first time just recently in the last presidential nightmare. And so you know, and then this is where I sort of go back and forth in terms of you know, I do my best to educate and to make those connections, but I don't want to hold those direct connections too tightly, because I never want to destabilize the historical moment in which the communities now and the students now are pushing back against historical forces of power beyond their control. There seems to be this sort of, I don't want to call it homogenizing, but maybe wet blanket force sometimes when you say, yeah, but look at what these people were doing back then. So that's probably where I try to not make too heavy-handed of connections between then and now, but also that speaks to that idea that the Chicano art is timeless because of the real, and why I say that is it's a play on this idea of timelessness as being sort of a form of value. But the reason I'm saying that is because many of the problems confronted and the human rights issues addressed in Chicano art are ongoing today. The implication of that is, well, then did it fail, right? That would be the dominant notion. And the answer to that is obviously no. But what I would argue is it speaks more to the resistance, the ongoing resistance to historical forces of power, first colonial, now neoliberal. I'm doing my best to answer these questions, but you can tell I'm dodging them just a little bit.
No, that's okay. Well, this is the final question. And again, to everybody in the audience who's still here, thank you for staying. I did drop a link to the survey. You're welcome to complete that following this at any time. But the final question, Ella, is, you know, you've written books, you've done the articles, you've been a researcher for many years now. There was a sensitive question I thought, you know, how have you changed in the process, or what impact has doing the research on Chicano art? How has it impacted you as an individual, as a person?
Oh, well, it changed my whole life. I believe that researchers like myself are seekers. I believed with my whole heart that foreword that I wrote, it wasn't an intellectual experience. It was a deeply frightening and emotional one when I got on that plane all by my big girl self and flew off to Virginia with the Sacramento Bee, you know, the newspaper on my little tray. And I was reading all about Esteban Villa and this line about the murals in the tunnel in downtown Sacramento. And he said, in the RCF, we fly below the radar. And I'm literally midair and I'm going, wait, where am I going? What? And sort of the existential crisis that I had at that moment, or maybe not, you know, maybe that's the westernization of myself, that it be existential, because the argument is, or is it Nepantla? Am I in a space, a constricted space between two bodies of water where I'm not this or that, but I'm changing, which is the Ansel Dewin anecdote, if you will, for indigenous concepts. And so it changed my whole life. I would argue that studying and reading and learning about local Chicanx art history. And I think this circles back to the question about localities in the Central Valley, that in doing that work, I became who I am as a person and finally found out who I was. And I think that as, you know, probably third generation in terms of the Chicano movement, I exist because these people existed, right? The roads and so I see another question, why are the highway routes in California important to Chicano history? Because we're people on the move, movidas. We got to get to work, we got to get to school, we got to move. And sometimes we've got to march, et cetera, et cetera. But we always come home, and home means many things. So the way that it changed me is just like Esteban, who, you know, I spent a good deal of time with, 4 or 5 years driving around Sacramento, and he would drop these one-liners on me. And like I said, with Montoya, confidence before competence. These are expressions that I live with on a daily basis. So how it's changed me now that I enter middle age and begin to lose my memory and all the great things that I studied and knew in that book, is it's distilled the message in the sense that, like my former, not even former, they're still with me, my mentors, these folks that I studied with, now I'm walking around with one-liners for a new generation too. So I finally reached that place, if you will, where through all that reading, all that talking, that writing, that presentation, the cracked molars, the whole thing to get the books out in the best way that I could get them out. Now it's just down to one-liners and zingers. And then hopefully the next generation will take that with them, and it'll help them along the way too.
Well, I'm sure you're very missed on the East Coast, but I speak for all of California. We're so happy to have you back as a resource across, the institutions. So thank you, Ella, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This webinar Q&A probably going to go on until 2 o'clock. We will post the recording on our Social Justice YouTube channel, and we will try to link to some of the great resources that Ella shared today. Go out and buy Ella's books if you have not bought them yet. Big thank you to Digital Ethnic Futures for sponsoring this, and all of you for being here. I will say as a closing note that in 2 weeks, we're going to host our third speaker for this webinar series, Jennifer Robin Terry, who is a professor of history and a scholar, and she's going to talk about child activists in the United Farmworkers. She has a brand new award-winning article in the Pacific Historical Review on this very topic. And so she'll complete our kind of trilogy of scholars and folks who are doing work on the Valley in interesting and interdisciplinary ways. But again, thank you, everybody. Please take the Qualtrics survey and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.